As we wind down our look at social psychology topics, we'd be remiss not to take a look at discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping, what we call in social psychology intergroup bias, because it is one of the most powerful and one of the most destructive forces in all of social psychology. It's something that we really can't escape. It's in the headlines most days. But let's look at why this exists, where the foundations are, and maybe what we could do to combat some of the negative aspects of these constructs. A couple of key terms that we've got. The first are stereotypes. Stereotypes are when you believe that a certain group of people have a particular set of characteristics. And so what that means is, there has to be groups for there to be stereotypes, but you think that everybody in whatever particular group has the same characteristics. And so if that is something, kind of a force there, then that's a stereotype. There are all kinds of stereotypes that we see. There can be regional stereotypes. There's always a rivalry between Indiana and Kentucky. There can be stereotypes between people in cities and people in more rural areas. But it's just any kind of just give you an example, like the idea of being a country bumpkin. If you live in a rural area, maybe you have an accent. A lot of times you'll see in movies and television shows that sophisticated people from the big city think that person is naive, right? Or will easily kind of preyed upon. And so you see those types of stereotypes that are out there. Prejudice is a negative attitude towards towards a certain group or its members. And so that word negative is really the key term there. When we experience prejudice, it's not a good thing. It's a negative feeling or emotion we're associating with that particular group. Discrimination is where you treat people differently based on their membership in a certain group. So it could be a religious group, could be an ethnic group, could be some type of activity that they do. But if you treat that person unfairly because they are in that group, then that's discrimination. And what we see with kind of the idea of modern racism, and the term modern racism, as it's stated, is that these people won't espouse or explicitly say racist beliefs, but they still have prejudice. So the prejudice is more hid under the surface, right? You could say our society's gotten to a point where we don't have much tolerance for people outright saying negative things about groups of people. But that doesn't mean people still don't have those feelings and in some way act on those feelings. So whereas if you went back to the 1800s, obviously there's a lot of racism between black and white. And people really didn't hide that fact, right? A lot of the literature from the day uses very derogatory terms, things like that. But today you wouldn't do that, but that doesn't mean that it's not there in more subtle forms of racism. And that's what we see kind of going in more of the modern world. Uh, One kind of cool social psychological experiment that deals with this is something called the Robbers Cave experiment. And in this experiment, the researchers actually tried to create intergroup conflict. They take a set of boys basically out to a summer camp. They separate the boys into two groups, and the two groups didn't know about each other at first. And so they just spend a little bit of time getting to know each other, building group camaraderie, and then the two groups are kind of thrown together in rivalry situations. So they're playing games or sports or things like that against each other to build up conflict between the two groups. But then what the experimenters wanted to do is see if they could overcome that idea of group, um, kind of the groups feeling like they didn't like each other. Wanted to see if they could overcome that. And so what they ended up doing is creating a crisis that was so big that only with the groups working together could the crisis be overcome. And then they kind of measured at the end, and lo and behold, a lot of the bad feelings, the animosity had gone away because they had to combine in order to meet this big challenge. So a lot of the stuff that had been created during the small little conflicts that were created were set aside once there was something bigger. And we see this a lot, right? I remember after the 9/11 attacks, for a short time, there really wasn't any difference between Democrat and Republican. A lot of the stuff that they usually fight over didn't seem important anymore in the face of this kind of existential danger to the nation. Now, obviously, that went away as we got further away from the threat, but it's a good example that when a challenge is too big, we can put aside some of those kind of petty disagreements. There are goals. There's a name for this. It's a type of goal called a superordinate goal. And the superordinate goal is something that transcends the interest of any small group. And so you see this in times of national crisis, where groups that maybe don't agree on a lot of things politically say, okay, we have a common enemy. See this in World War II, right? The Soviets don't have a ton in common with the British and the Americans, but they do have this enormous threat to them all in Nazi Germany. And so they're able to put aside those differences until the threat of Nazi Germany is taken care of. Same thing happens in the United States in World War I. I'm reading a book about women's suffrage movement in World War, as the 19th Amendment gets passed right after the First World War. And it talked about how those groups, even though they thought suffrage was really important, were willing to put aside some of those disagreements because the war effort itself was deemed to be more important. So it's something that can happen. One more example, if you've ever seen the movie Miracle, right? It's a story of the 1980 Olympic hockey team, and the coach brings in all these great players from all across the country, but they've all played on different hockey teams before, and so they don't like each other. Well, what he decides to do is set himself up as kind of the ultimate villain, so that they will have something in common. Their animosity towards him will be kind of a bonding moment that they can take advantage of, and it works beautifully. Right? It's the idea that you've got a common cause that you're striving for. There is something called social identity theory, and social identity theory we've referred to previously, but just to review, it's the theory that a person's identity comes from not only their own accomplishments, but the accomplishment of any group to which they belong. And so it's not just what we're able to do, it's the people we associate ourselves with and how they're doing. And so that's why sometimes people can get positive or negative feelings when really they didn't have much to do with it, when their team wins a big game. Or their political party wins an election, or their group affiliation wins something. They get self-esteem from being a part of that group. We see it a lot in sports. I went to Indiana University for my undergrad work. Have been a Hoosier fan my entire life. It was one of the reasons I went to college there, was I figured out I get to go to Indiana basketball games. And so when the Hoosiers are doing well, it is easy to walk with a little more bounce in your step. The football team had a really good year this year after not being very good for a long time. And so you could see a lot of IU fans that were kind of puffing out their chests a little bit because of that. Basketball team hasn't been doing real great as of late. Hopefully they'll turn that around. But the same kind of thing could happen. People get really kind of mean about that, right? They'll want to get rid of the players or fire the coaches, but a lot of it's because part of their own identity is wrapped up in how that team's doing. But we do this all the time. We do it with clubs that people join, churches that people will join, even alumni associations. We start to associate ourselves with groups of people because we have those things in common. And it goes back kind of that idea of grouping, that there's safety in groups, and it's usually a little more stable bit of our identity. The interesting thing is what happens when that group identity changes. Really famously, the Red Sox of Major League Baseball were terrible for a lot of years. They couldn't get over the hump, couldn't win a World Series, and that kind of bonded the fan base, that they just always kind of choked in big moments and weren't able to accomplish that ultimate goal. And then the 2000s, the Red Sox got really good. They won like 3 World Series in the decade, and now all these people who had this identity suddenly don't have this identity anymore, and so they have to adopt the posture of being winners. The Chicago Cubs, kind of close to our own home, were the lovable losers, and then win their first World Series in 100 years, and people really don't know how to act. Right? That's not the group identity that they're used to. I really like this little cartoon. I think it sums up well how our perspective really influences these decisions that we make. Right? If you look at this, you have 2 identical looking villages on either side. Right? But in one side, it's the group you belong to. You're in your blessed homeland with your glorious leader, your great religion, your noble populace, and your heroic adventures. But on the other side, right, they have a wicked despot, a primitive superstition, they're backwater savages, and they're brutish invaders. But they're exactly the same. The only difference is you belong to one group and you don't belong to the other. And so when you think about that, it could be anything from inter-school rivalries, right, to rivalries that you have with particular groups at school. But usually from our perspective, our group is the best. They're the righteous. And then we ascribe some worse things to the other group. Again, it's kind of like fundamental attribution error that we talked about a little earlier. There are some other theories that come to fruition in this as well. One is frustration aggression theory, and this is one where a lot of aggression comes from people being frustrated. And so a lot of action that we take as a group or against groups comes from frustration. 2020, we saw several examples of this. Right? When George Floyd was murdered, there was a reaction from that group, from the American community that looked and said, we're tired of this happening. We're frustrated that this type of thing continues to happen. But then there's a blowback from the other side, right? And another group saying, well, we feel like we've been over backwards, and now all of a sudden, from being the group that was on top or in power the whole time, we feel like those things are being taken and threatened, and so that group is frustrated. And what we find is the more frustrated a group gets, the more likely they are to become aggressive, which of course is where those kinds of things can be very dangerous. Stereotype threats are people's fears of confirming stereotypes that others have regarding a group to which they're a member. Now, this is kind of interesting, right? So if you're part of a group and you know that there's a stereotype about that group, this suggests that you will intentionally go out of your way to not confirm those stereotypes. So say you're in the band and there's a stereotype about people that are in the band, but you go out of your way to make sure that you don't fit into those stereotypes. A good example of this could be preachers' kids. right? You always hear the stories of the preacher's kids that are a little wilder just because they're trying to prove that they're not goody two shoes, right? Or they're not just following what their parents say. Now, if you're a preacher's kid out there and you didn't rebel, don't take that personally. But I think probably we've all heard some stories where that's the case. Give me some examples of stereotypes. All white Americans are obese, lazy, and dim-witted. Maybe the Homer Simpson stereotype. Mexican stereotypes suggest all Mexicans are lazy and came to America illegally. Right? This is something that is having to be fought against as we debate immigration on a national level. All Arabs and Muslims are terrorists after 9/11. That was definitely the case. We see the same thing after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? When Franklin Roosevelt signs the executive order to round up Japanese Americans and place them into internment camps. All people who live in England have bad teeth. All blacks outside of the United States are poor. All Jews are greedy. Asians are good at math. They eat rice and drive slow. Irish people are drunks and eat potatoes. Those are examples of stereotypes, right? They're beliefs that people have about a whole particular group, but we know that those things aren't true of the group and aren't true of most individuals that are in that group. You have just as much of a chance of being obese, lazy, and dim-witted. Dim-witted if you are any race as being white. But we look at those stereotypes, and sometimes they get reinforced by things like television and movies that play on those stereotypes in order to get laughs or be dramatic. Things like that. You'll see people playing on these stereotypes to drum up fear to get elected. And things like that can also be something that's happening. The problem is some of these things can become self-fulfilling prophecies. We talked about these too, but if you're a member of a group and you feel like these stereotypes are there, maybe some of those things rub off to the point where you don't feel like you have the ability to do what you want to do or to reach your full potential. Those sorts of things. And so, again, these are the kinds of things that we need to combat in ourselves, right? Not having, or maybe not even not having, but knowing that we are susceptible to these stereotypes and actively fighting against them, but also understanding that we're vulnerable to thinking about the stereotypes people may have about us, and that can affect our behavior as well. So this is really a two-way street where these things can have an effect. But again, it takes kind of that thoughtful processing level for us to have these difficult conversations with ourselves, with our friends, talking about these things, how we can move past maybe some stereotypical beliefs that we have that aren't true about other groups, but also in not being susceptible to what other people think of maybe a group that we belong to.